Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter.
Conan Doyle, of course, is best known for his Sherlock Holmes stories, but in this podcast we'll be looking at some of his more obscure work, and we're starting with his 1891 novel, The Doings of Raffles Haw. Why did you choose this one, Mark?
Yeah, this is my fault, isn't it, this one?
Indeed.
No, I really like Doings of Raffles Haw. I think the reason for picking this one was that, really three things. I think the first is that it's written at a really pivotal moment in Doyle's career, right at that point where he is moving from being a practicing medic to being a full-time writer. And so I think there's something quite significant in this being one of those books that is written right at that turning point. It's also a book that spans a number of genres. I mean, Doyle is known as a genre writer, but actually this is an example of a piece of writing where he borrows from a whole range of genres. He's no great respecter of genres. He's more a great storyteller in that sense. And I think third, and probably more relevant for this podcast, is the fact that this is virtually unknown. Very few people have written about the Doings of Raffles Haw, and yet it's a work that actually is quite influential in its own way and has lots of influences and tells us lots of things about Doyle's life and work. So I think it's a decent one to start with.
Absolutely.
So why don't we get started by giving listeners a bit of background on the story, just so people will be familiar with what we're talking about.
Right. Well, The Doings of Raffles Haw opens on a snowy night in the modest and cosy Mcintyre household in the Midlands village of Tamfield. The Mcintyres, father, son and daughter, live in genteel poverty due to the failure of Mcintyre Senior's once prosperous Birmingham gun manufactory. Mcintyre is a drunk, but whether this is a cause or effect of the calamity is unclear. His son, Robert, is a struggling artist of underdeveloped talent, whilst his daughter, Laura, keeps their home in order, or at least until she marries her childhood sweetheart, the bluff and hearty naval officer Hector Spurling, son of the local vicar. On this opening evening, Hector, prior to a Mediterranean tour of duty, and the Mcintyre siblings, their father is in the local hostelry, are discussing a mysterious new arrival in the village. Raffles Haw appears to be a very wealthy young man who has built an ostentatious mansion for himself, and Tamfield is alive with speculation as to his character, antecedents and intentions. Robert soon has a chance encounter with the enigmatic stranger, and is invited on a tour of his fantastic home, which proves to be a veritable treasure house and a scientific marvel, a dream palace from the Arabian Nights fitted out with all mod cons. Haw takes a liking to Robert and encourages his artistic ambitions, whilst also engaging him as an agent in his own philanthropic schemes. In time he comes to trust Robert so much that he reveals to him the secret of his wealth. He is a modern alchemist who has discovered an electrical process whereby he can turn base metals into gold. He feels, however, that the fruits of his discovery should be shared, and embarks upon a program of wealth redistribution. But his largesse has unfortunate consequences, not least upon the Mcintyres, whose characters are reshaped negatively by their proximity to limitless wealth. Robert becomes listless and idle. Laura throws over Hector to become engaged to Raffles Haw. Worst of all, old Mcintyre's greed and selfishness reach monumental proportions, setting in train a series of events which culminate in tragedy. Indeed.
And I think we'll come to what that tragedy is a bit later in the podcast. But it's a really interesting little story, this, isn't it? And fundamentally, it's a moral tale, isn't it?
Yes, it's a kind of modern fairy tale in many ways, and a very basic moral to it about the evils and of greed and what can go wrong if you have far too much wealth and you don't know how to apply it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of stuff in there about perhaps Doyle's attitude to wealth or at least philanthropy as well.
And at this time it's quite interesting in that he's musing on money in a way that he's just about to break through and make money with his writing, but he's still very much the struggling writer at this point. He's on the cusp, and he will, within a number of months, write A Scandal in Bohemia, which will really make his fortune. He started with the White Company, but it is the Sherlock Holmes short stories that will push him into that first rank of writers who make a lot of money. And obviously in this book he's probably musing in his own head and thinking, what would it be like if?
Yes, that's a very good point. And there's even the character of Robert, who is really the eye of the story for most of Doings of Raffles Haw, is himself a struggling artist. There's almost the nobility of the struggling artist at this point in time, which reflects where Doyle was, that conflict to some extent between art for art's sake and art for wealth or for prosperity.
And also the element with Robert is that he knows he's not in the top rank.
Yes.
He knows he's struggling, and he knows his own kind of second rank status, and that's another thing that obviously bothers him. And Raffles Haw is very thoughtless in pointing this out to Robert at one point.
So I think on that point, what we'll do is maybe go into a bit of the writing and publication history at this point, because like I said at the outset, this is a really interesting time in Doyle's life, and you've just pointed out again that this, what is going on in the book is almost reflective of what's happening for Doyle himself. So this story really comes about towards the end of 1890, beginning of 1891, and towards the end of 1890, Doyle is in practice in Southsea. It's not proving to be terribly lucrative. He then has a trip over to Berlin in November to find out about a tuberculosis cure, and he meets along the way somebody called Malcolm Morris.
Malcolm Morris was a Harley Street dermatologist who would eventually become Sir Malcolm Morris, a very eminent man. And he sees Doyle's background as a struggling GP and says, well, what you should try and do is become a specialist. And he suggests that Doyle becomes an ophthalmic specialist because, well, everybody always wants to look after their eyes, so there's money in that, dear boy. And Doyle has a think about this and takes up his advice. And
he comes back from that trip to Berlin and almost straight away decides that he's going to go off to Vienna to study. And he starts planning a study trip for January. But in the meantime, he gets contacted by Alfred Harmsworth, who is the editor and owner, I think, of a penny magazine called Answers, which had by then just reached about 300,000 circulation. And Alfred asks Doyle if he's interested in putting forward a story. And Doyle gives him his rate, which at the time is £5 1,000 words, which would be about £300 today, which doesn't sound that far off what people would get paid now either. And he comes up with that idea, but he asks for a quick response from Harmsworth because he needs to know if he's going to have the money so that he can afford to go to Vienna. So Doyle travels with his wife to Vienna in early January 1891, and miraculously, over pretty much 2 weeks, he writes 30,000 words, alongside attending lectures at the local hospital to learn more about ophthalmic treatments, and of course enjoying Vienna. So it's quite amazing that he's actually able to produce 30,000 words in 2 weeks.
But he has problems. He's struggling at the time with the lectures, because even though he is pretty conversant in German, he's not very good with the technical language of German, so a lot of the lectures begin to get beyond him.
So Doyle returns to Portsmouth and pretty much immediately says that he's actually going to set up in London and takes lodgings at Montague Place, which is round the corner from Montague Street, where famously Sherlock Holmes is meant to have taken his lodgings.
Absolutely.
And then he takes also offices at Devonshire Place at the top of Wimpole Street near Harley Street. But he's also working for
the Westminster Ophthalmic Hospital.
Yeah, so Doyle actually likes to present himself as being, an empty surgery at this point in time when he sets up, but actually he's quite busy.
It's all part of the Doyle legend. It's repeating in many ways the Southsea story again. Here I am starting again in a consulting room where nobody's coming to see me, so therefore I will write.
So just a bit on the publication history itself. So Doyle then submits The Doings of Raffles Haw to Alfred Harmsworth, and it eventually appears in syndication in Answers in December 1891 through to February 1892. He actually also, in 1891, in typical entrepreneurial spirit, he actually sells it to SS McClure for US syndication rights, which means that it then appears in a whole series of papers across the United States in summer and autumn of 1891, which gives a peculiar twist to one part of the publication history, which is the first American edition, which actually contains Doings of Raffles Haw, but also The Red-Headed League and The Boscombe Valley Mystery. The first time they appear in book form is actually probably pirated, because I don't think Doyle had actually given them the rights to the two Sherlock Holmes stories, but the publisher Lovell had managed to pad out the edition with two Sherlock Holmes stories.
Doyle was probably getting used to being pirated at this time.
Oh yeah, quite a lot, absolutely. So one of the major themes that comes out in the Doings of Raffles Haw, but also in other Doyle work more generally, is alcoholism. And that's a very personal subject for Conan Doyle for a whole range of reasons.
Yes, his father, it was one of the big secrets of Doyle's life that he managed to keep to himself as a very famous man, that his own father suffered from alcoholism throughout much of his adult life. And by the time Doyle is actually writing Raffles Haw and the early Sherlock Holmes stories, his father had been institutionalised in a number of different asylums throughout Scotland. And Doyle had seen the effects of alcoholism within the domestic circle at very, very close quarters. And it becomes a theme throughout much of his fiction. It's very pertinent with Raffles Haw because old Mcintyre is depicted very much as a drunk. When the book opens, he's very much a self-pitying drunk, and the collapse of his business is everybody's fault but his own. And as the story goes on, he becomes more and more bitter as Raffles Haw refuses to share the wealth with old Mcintyre because he's figured out his personality that he would just fritter it away anyway. Yeah. Which Doyle himself had seen within his own household. His mother had to keep very, very close charge of the finances. His own father would get hold of any money lying around the house and he would spend it on drink. So old Mcintyre is very much based on this sort of character, and we see his character descend until at the end he descends into madness, which Doyle had seen with his own father. Although suspect Charles Doyle wasn't quite as unpleasant.
No.
Entirely as old Mcintyre, but there's certainly a degree of that. And what's interesting at this particular time as well is there's a short story which is published in a magazine called People in 1891 called A Sordid Affair. Which depicts an artist descending into drunkenness in a much more sympathetic way to old Mcintyre. So it seems quite clear that Doyle had very mixed feelings towards his own father's alcoholism and could be both condemnatory and sympathetic.
And it appears as a theme, doesn't it, throughout all of Doyle's work, really. I mean, even if you just take the Sherlock Holmes stories, which most people will be more familiar with, you get characters like Black Peter, you get Jim Browner in the cardboard box, you get Eustace Brackenstall. These are all characters who are, in their own different ways, alcoholic. I mean, Jim Browner is probably the most tragic of the cases in that he's actually taken the pledge, but he is manipulated by his sister-in-law and ends up breaking the pledge again.
And it's the two sides of alcoholism. With Jim Browner, he knows he's got a problem and he tries to fight it. And it all comes out in one blaze of violence at one point, but he's not an inherently violent man. Whereas with Sir Eustace Brackenstall, he is depicted very much as an inherently violent man who drink just makes it worse. So again, you've got the two contrasting sides, which Doyle will have seen in his own father's behaviour.
And when we were talking before about Raffles Haw, just before recording the podcast, one of the things that we were observing was that actually there's quite a lot of biographical details that then appear in this particular writer. I mean, in fact, Doyle is quite a biographical writer in that sense. He does borrow an awful lot from his own experience, but there are things in here like the labour-saving devices around the Raffles Haw's amazing household. That smacks of Doyle's personal interest in devices and gadgets and technology. But there are other things as well.
Other examples include where Hector Sperling is desperate to marry Laura Mcintyre, just wants to get on with it, and he's not really bothered about marriage settlements, and he talks about, being a naval man, talks about living in Portsmouth, and we have him saying, "We need not have a house, why should we? You can get a very nice rooms in Southsea at £2 a week." Doyle himself had lived in Southsea as a struggling doctor. He'd gone there in 1882, found a house at One Bush Villas, and he paid £10 a year for that. So he's echoing his own experiences through Hector Sperling.
And the other thing that I think comes out in Doings of Raffles Haw is the point about heredity and this notion that you inherit the characteristics of your father. It's very carefully done in Doings of Raffles Haw, because you set up with the domestic scene of the Mcintyres, old Mcintyre with Robert and Laura, and you even get that sense right in that first scene that Laura may be going to go down her father's track. Right from that first chapter, you get that sense that there could be something there. And he plays on that theme of heredity both here and in a lot of other work.
And it's the idea of heredity. He has Robert Mcintyre. When he describes Robert Mcintyre, you have him described as, in his mouth only there was something, a suspicion of coarseness, a possibility of weakness, which in the eyes of some, and of his sister among them, marred the grace and beauty of his features. Yet, as he was wont himself to say, when one thinks that each poor mortal is heir to a legacy of every evil trait or bodily taint of so vast a line of ancestors, lucky indeed is the man who does not find that nature has scored up some long-awaiting family debt upon his features. And with the idea of heredity is very strong in this story, but also the idea of, is heredity the only driving feature, or is heredity, when exposed to wealth or drink, or is it just personal weakness, or is this to do with heredity? So he is asking these questions throughout this story. And how much are we to blame for our own actions, and how much is it just part of our inescapable hereditary destiny?
Yeah, it's almost a nature-nurture argument again. And you get that, again, when in the Sherlock Holmes stories you get Moran and that line about trees growing to a certain height and then becoming
some unsightly
tendencies. And the other one is, of course, Art in the Blood is liable to take the strangest forms, which is, again, heredity. And I wonder if that's Doyle, the thought that perhaps he had inherited some of his father's characteristics.
I think he has this worry. What is interesting, certainly as regards drink, is that Doyle himself was never a teetotaler.
No.
But he did know how to watch himself with the drink. So it never actually put him off, but it certainly made him temper his behaviour.
That's a really good point, yeah. And then alcoholism carries through in all of his writing, doesn't it, really? I mean, you get other ones that we might cover in later podcasts, things like the Japan Box, which is a lovely story where I won't give away the twist because it's about a recovering alcoholic.
And again, it's another aristocrat who can have tendencies towards brutality. He's a kinder version of Eustace Brackenstall.
Yes, absolutely. And then somewhat more silly story, The Bully of Broca's Court, which is 1921, quite a late story.
Surprisingly late in his career.
Very late, but that's involves a ghostly alcoholic in that one. I wonder if it's worth taking a moment to think about this as a genre piece as well, because we're increasingly seeing Doyle referred to as a great genre writer. But I think one of the concerns about that is that can be said sometimes a bit pejoratively. It's a way of separating a writer from proper literature, as it were. But he actually does have a great command of genre, but doesn't seem to be a great respecter of it. He can borrow all manner of different things, and Raffles Haw is interesting in that it's got bits of a whole range of different genres in it as well, but there are some in particular that leap out.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it's certainly an early example of a science fiction novel, very much influenced by the sort of science fiction of Jules Verne, and later H.G. Wells would take this on. And you could almost look at Raffles Haw as in places it's almost proto-steampunk.
Yes.
In the way that he uses this technology and extrapolates upon technology and says, what can we do with this? And the house itself, it's very much the house of the future, and I think Doyle is playing in his own mind with it. One day we might all live in houses that are absolutely full of gadgets, and it has come to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a great piece in the middle of the book about how Raffles Haw's house consists of it's basically like the great glass elevator from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and it moves between different ecosystems, essentially, doesn't it? The room actually moves around a network of greenhouses, I think, within the house.
It's a form of alternative reality in many ways, but it's not the way we would understand by putting a headset on. Raffles Haw actually does build these things and uses very much theatrical effects, smoke and mirrors with perspective paintings, behind palm trees, sand and the like, and the use of heat and cold.
And there's that nice point in there as well about some of Raffles Haw's schemes, which are themselves these sort of grand madcap schemes. I like the one about being able to finish off a series of canals to improve trade routes across the world just by essentially building off a whole load of Panama canals at various different points in the world. That's one of his grand schemes for his enormous wealth.
And drilling through the earth.
So that
you can build a railway from London to the Antipodes. Somehow avoiding the core.
Yeah. And Paul, you've talked about the Vernian influence on Raffles Haw's house, but you think there might also be another French connection here?
Yes, Doyle was brought up on French writing by his mother, and one of the writers we know he definitely read later on was the great decadent writer J.K. Huysmans. He did read Huysmans' book about Satanism, Là-bas, in the 1890s, but Huysmans really came to attention with an 1884 novel called À rebours, Against Nature, in which a decadent young dandy locks himself away in his house and each room matches his moods. And he has he's fascinated by colours, scents, and he one of his things is gems, and Raffles Haw has a room of gems which he enjoys showing off, and I'm pretty certain that by this point Doyle had read À rebours and some remembrance of it in his mind, or again maybe tribute, comes out in Raffles Haw.
And there are lots of other writers around this time that Doyle might have taken influence from. I think you were looking at a few of the possible sources and inspirations for Doyle's story.
Well, certainly with this we have the influence of Jules Verne. Doyle had read and loved Jules Verne's stories from his childhood, and certainly with this idea of a tunnel through the centre of the earth, you've got, I think, little doubt that that's him thinking about Journey to the Centre of the Earth. But he's also in the tradition of, you could say, from Frankenstein. With this idea of again the moral responsibility of the scientist, because Raffles Haw we find is a scientist who has accidentally found this way of using electricity to transmute base metals into gold, but he does this at first without thinking of the consequences, but then he does think, what do I do with this power? And he does decide that only he can have this power, simply because it would what's the point in having gold if everybody can make it? It would just destroy the world economy. So it isn't done for reasons of pure selfishness. I will have all the gold and I will have all the power. But it's very much, as I say, in this tradition of Frankenstein, where there's the moral story at the heart of it. Frankenstein creates life, but does he think of the consequences of his actions? And you could say the same with Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is published in 1886, just shortly before Raffles Haw, where you have Henry Jekyll inventing the process whereby he can release the evil from himself so that he can get on with doing good things, but he doesn't actually think about the evil that Hyde is doing is undoing all the good that Jekyll is doing. So it's a pointless procedure. And
it's interesting in that sense that Raffles Haw is a much more moral character, but he comes across as being quite a naive character as well. He doesn't seem to be able to actually filter the various different requests he gets for money, and that's actually why he latches onto Robert in the story, is that he wants somebody else to help him to spend the money. And when he becomes close to Laura, Robert's sister, they are then planning together all these great schemes for greater good. But he's not aware of the consequences, as you say. And when he does become aware of them, it becomes far more tragic consequences for himself and other people around him as well.
It's Doyle in many ways musing upon ideas that would then find their way into the welfare state.
Yeah.
The fear that conservatives have always had of a welfare state. So, well, if you hand money out, where's the incentive to work?
Yeah.
And this is the idea that Doyle is playing with in this story, and we do get the point at the end where some of the workmen in the village lose their self-reliance because they simply write letters to Raffles Haw.
And as you said at the beginning with the synopsis, with Robert, there's a creeping corruption of the impact of all this available wealth, in that he starts to lose interest in his art, and he can no longer see the point of it, and that becomes more and more pronounced as we go along. He himself becomes lazy and unable to focus on the great artistic talents that he feels he should be able to cultivate and develop.
And he has this point where his last unfinished great canvas is sitting in the attic covered in dust, unfinished, uncared for, and it stands as a metaphor for his own loss of self-reliance and for his own sense of what he could have been, and it stands as Dorian Gray's portrait stands as a moral barometer for him. And this dusty canvas, which is never going to be finished, is another form of moral barometer for Robert.
And that's a great point about Dorian Gray, because Dorian Gray is one of those stories that is closely connected with Doyle because of the commissioning of Dorian Gray and The Sign of Four at the same time, and those books are twinned in many ways, as we might get onto in another podcast. And you think that there's a connection there with Invisible Man as well?
Well, I think there's a great possibility that H.G. Wells had read Raffles Haw, and Raffles Haw opens with the character coming into a village, disrupting it, being at the centre of rumours and causing problems within the village. At the beginning of The Invisible Man, Griffin turns up out of nowhere in the middle of a village himself and is the centre of gossip. And what's he up to? It's a very similar sort of opening. There's
an interesting story comes out 3 years after Doings of Raffles Haw by Wells called The Diamond Maker, and that really follows. Well, it's a businessman encounters somebody who's on the down really, and a tramp as such, who is actually offering him manufactured diamonds. And you sort of see the consequences of that individual having had that power, and you're left at the end of the story with a question mark as to whether or not the individual is real and has actually got this capability or not.
And you've also got the similar problems in that story with the diamond maker himself has the same problems as Raffles Haw. Is how do you get this money into the world? Where does it come from? So where would all these? There are inevitably going to be questions asked. Where have these diamonds all come from? And in Raffles Haw, there's a speculation: has he found a hitherto unknown gold mine in South Africa? And so the diamond maker has to work in secret and is mistaken for a bomb-making anarchist and has to go on the run.
Yeah, and there's actually old Mcintyre has the suspicion that Raffles Haw has got his wealth through ill-gotten gains as well. The other connection there is that Wells and Doyle are both drawing on contemporary science. Wells, in the case of the diamond maker, is drawing on science at the time, which was to the ability to actually create artificial diamonds. And there was a French scientist who had done just that in 1893, so just the year before the diamond maker, although the technology had gone back to the 1870s. But there's also Doyle's drawing on atomic chemistry.
This is Doyle's own scientific background coming out. He's not entirely making the science up, which so many of these writers do, and they fudge the issue of how these breakthroughs were made. Frankenstein, we never find out exactly how life is given. Jekyll and Hyde, it's a mixture of powders. It's all very vague. Whereas in Raffles Haw, Doyle does actually give some sort of logic using atomic weights as to how you would progress from bismuth through lead and mercury to gold. And he gives the actual atomic weights in the story. And in a letter from Vienna to his mother, written in January 1891, he actually puts a PS in and shows how his brother Innes had helped him in this, and he says in this PS, "Thanks Innes for atomic weights, just arrived. It is for an alchemist." So he'd obviously had his brother go down to the library and find these atomic weights for him. So, but it does show at least Doyle felt that there has to be some scientific verisimilitude in the story. It's not good enough to just vaguely say, "and then I found gold."
Yeah, and that's a lovely little find there in the letters. So you have Doyle being influenced by other people, potentially Dorian Gray. You then have Doyle also influencing others in turn in possibly H.G. Wells in Invisible Man and Diamond Maker. But there's also a really obvious connection of influence here, which is in the name Raffles Haw itself, because of course Doyle's brother-in-law was E.W. Hornung, who wrote the Raffles novels, and is there a connection there?
Well, we know that Hornung did take the name from Raffles Haw as a little tribute to his brother-in-law, and he actually did dedicate the first volume of Raffles' stories, The Amateur Cracksman, to Doyle as a way of skewed compliment. Doyle himself was always a little uneasy with this because he felt that you shouldn't make the villain the hero. So it sat uncomfortably with him. But the origins of the name Raffles Haw, very, very strange name in itself, and I think where does this come from? And looking around, I'm pretty certain that it comes from Doyle's own personal experience. In June 1879, when he was still a trainee doctor, he worked as an assistant in Birmingham, which is where Raffles Haw is set in a village near Birmingham. Doyle worked as an assistant to a Dr. Reginald Ratcliffe Haw of Clifton House, Aston Road, Birmingham. And you look at the name and you think Reginald Ratcliffe Haw equals Raffles Haw. And shortly before Doyle actually wrote Raffles Haw, before Christmas 1890, he and his wife Louise they stayed over with Reginald and Amy Haw. So he kept in touch with Haw, and Haw was a great influence on his life. So I feel this is again it's a little skewed tribute that Doyle is paying to his mentor. That's a
really good point. And there's another tribute we should mention here as well, which is Malcolm Morris, who later Sir Malcolm Morris, the dermatologist, who Doyle met back in Berlin. Actually, Doings of Raffles Haw is dedicated to Malcolm Morris, so still fresh in his memory. So where do you think Doyle might have got the name Raffles from?
Well, Raffles, I feel there's no evidence for this, but Doyle was very interested in imperial history, amongst other things. And I feel that he's taken the name from the founder of Singapore, Stamford Raffles.
Yes.
And it's interesting that the friend of Watson's who introduces him to Sherlock Holmes is called Stamford. So I feel this is where the names come from.
Yeah, that's a good spot. I can see that being the case. And you see a lot in many of Doyle's writings. He will borrow names, and they will reappear in lots of different stories. I think, beginning of the Return collection of Sherlock Holmes, there are several names that are repeated in about 4 or 5 stories consecutively.
How many Hudsons do we have?
How many Hudsons, indeed, yeah. Well, we're on the subject of the identity of Raffles Haw. There's a little bit of Sherlockian whimsy I should mention briefly, which I discovered from an old Baker Street journal back in 1947, where Christopher Morley, one of the founding fathers of the Sherlockian movement, really, wrote a regular column called Clinical Notes by a Resident Patient. And in it he supposes that Raffles Haw is actually Raffles Holmes, and perhaps the unknown third and youngest brother of the Holmes brothers. But he has a very interesting point at the end of this, which is about I don't suppose there are a dozen people living who have read The Doings of Raffles Haw, but it's plain to those that have that Haw was a code pseudonym for Holmes. Why else would Willie Hornung, to tease Watson, have picked on the name Raffles? And he goes on to say that actually Raffles Haw is tall, he's lean, he's pale, he's an incessant smoker, he's prone to chuckling, he wears dark dressing gown, he's a chemist, and He says, he had all the Sherlockian stigmata, but he was hysterical, idealistic, and hypersensitive. He was ruined, killed even by his pure love for a woman. Hence, and no one has dared admit it before, Sherlock's horrid cynicism about the sex. And that brings us really to the tragedy at the end of the Doings of Raffles Haw.
Yes, which again we see the influences coming out here. It's too close to be a coincidence. In that on the night of the final tragedy, Raffles Haw's butler, Jones, knocks on the door of the Mcintyre house and says, "Can you come along, Master? There's something wrong with Master. He's locked himself in his laboratory." And so Robert Mcintyre and the local bobby have to break the door in, and they find that Raffles Haw has destroyed his laboratory, and in the midst of it all sits his body. And it's so similar to the ending of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where Jekyll is turning into Hyde involuntarily and back again constantly and knows there's no escape. He locks himself in his laboratory, and his friend Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, has to break in the door with the help of Poole, the butler, and they find that at the end Hyde and Jekyll have committed suicide in the laboratory amidst the wreckage of all his experimentation.
Yeah, very, very reminiscent of that scene. And it's actually quite an ambiguous moment in the way that it's written by Doyle, in that there's a suggestion. Well, Raffles Haw actually leaves a letter, doesn't he, to Robert, and in it he says that he has a pain in his side. But the destruction of the laboratory is deliberate, and it's quite clear that he has suffered, and there's a great exchange with the constable, isn't there? That how did he die? And Robert says he died of a broken heart. But the strong implication is that this is a suicide, and he's destroyed the laboratory and to protect the secret and protect mankind from the secret, really, for the greater good.
And the other tragedy at the end is that Robert Mcintyre knew there was a piece of paper with the secret on it. He's convinced that still exists, and he's convinced he can find out how this gold process, Raffles Haw showed him part of it. He's convinced he can finish it, so he's going to spend the rest of his life in search of El Dorado.
Yeah,
he's not going to find it.
It's a really interesting ending, actually, in that sense, because you have, in terms of the characters that we've seen, old Mcintyre is sectioned, which actually mirrors what happened to Doyle's father himself, and then you have Robert is essentially depicted burrowing away in a chemistry laboratory trying to find the secret he'll never find. But we also have Laura devotes her life to philanthropy, which is about the first selfless thing that she actually does in the entire book. But the character who comes out unscathed, interestingly, is Laura's former fiancé, Hector. And there's a really interesting point at the end that Hector is the one who, right from the beginning, from the very first chapter, is morally incorruptible. In the first chapter, he's found a £50 note, and he wants to find the owner to give it back because he thinks the owner will be distraught at losing so much money. And Laura says, "Well, why don't you keep it?" And sure enough, at the end of the novel, Hector is the one who actually has survived the spreading influence of Raffles Haw wealth because he hasn't been in the village, and perhaps he was never a morally corruptible character anyway.
I get the feelings where he just simply doesn't understand what's going on as well, and cares nothing for it.
So that nicely brings us to the end of the Doings of Raffles Haw. What did you make of the story, having reread it again for the first time in many years?
I think it's a very interesting early science fiction story. I think there's an awful lot going on for such a short book. There's an awful lot going on there. The speculation within it, the kind of Wellesian, Vernian speculation is enormously interesting. But also the fact that Doyle brings his artistic sensitivities to this as well, and is able to make a moral story. This isn't just about gadgets and science. This is about morality. This is about responsibility, moral responsibility. It's a very interesting blend, and in terms of Doyle biography, it's absolutely fascinating, and the fact that we really do also see the professional writer at work, that he can just write this story in 2 weeks to commission, and this is the way when you look at Doyle's bibliography, how he could be so prolific.
And I think that point about storytelling is very well made, because that's the thing that really strikes me about Doings of Raffles Haw, having read it again for the first time in many years, that actually this is quite a well-paced story, and Doyle really very deftly handles the setup of the Mcintyre family and what is going to happen to them. He positions lots of clues in those early chapters, and there are some terrific moments within the book. The one that I think really stood out for me is the moment where Laura has decided that she is no longer going to be with Hector, and she has switched her allegiance to Raffles Haw, and Robert knows that this is really for the money. It's not really for love of Raffles Haw. But the person who really points it out very pointedly is old Mcintyre. And old Mcintyre berates Robert for essentially ignoring the fact that Laura is just manipulating the situation. And of course, as he does that, Raffles Haw is in the doorway and hears this, and at that instant Raffles Haw actually says, I stand by Laura and I stand by Robert, and he turns against old Mcintyre. But actually Mcintyre's hitting at a deeper truth there, and it's a great moment of Victorian melodrama in the middle of it. You also get some terrific moments of comedy. We didn't mention that there's an entire chapter which is basically focused on the fact that Laura has said that she wants to, what she'd really want to do most in the world is to see a tiger, and Raffles Haw essentially telegraphs somebody in Liverpool to bring down a tiger. So there's a chapter which is just a tiger turns up in the village, which is his, typical Doyle bit of humour that's thrown into the mix in the middle of the story.
I feel with that there is a lot of whimsy throughout it, definitely, and again I feel. There is a degree of the influence of Robert Louis Stevenson here, and particularly books like the New Arabian Nights and the whimsy that goes on there. But this is also contrasted with there's a real sense of irony and cynicism goes through the book as well, and in that you have the family setup at the beginning. It's all depicted as very cosy. And this is the ideal Victorian family. They've lost their mother, but they've managed to stay together. And you get these glimpses as you go on of this family is not what it seems, and it's Doyle again, perhaps looking back at his own family and thinking, the ideal of family life isn't what it's cracked up to be. And there are definite with this family. It's to go back to Mcintyre and Laura. He's proud of his daughter because she's very much her father's daughter, yes, with her mercenary motivation, and he approves of what she's doing.
Yeah, he does. He's going to get the money one way or another, isn't he? So that brings us to the end of the Doings of Raffles Haw. What have we got planned next time, Paul?
For next time we have planned The Winning Shot, which is an early short story, first published in 1883, dealing with hypnotism and doubles.
Hypnotism and doubles, excellent, and going back even further into Doyle's writing career. So we hope you've enjoyed the podcast today. If you want to find out more about some of the books and influences that we've referenced, then go to the website doingsofdoyle.com, where we'll be posting the show notes. And do join us next time when we'll be talking about The Winning Shot. So until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.